Good evening, sinners and saints! Welcome to the Sin Hound Show. That is me, your local DJ, or I guess it's VJ with the video. That's the benefit of being online. Everybody gets to see your glorious beauty. Feast upon it, children. See the beauty of your Sin Hound. Well, I'm not here to talk about my own beauty. You know, I have to shield it to protect my many, many followers from the potential of lust. This is why I stay cloaked in darkness, so that you are not tempted. But what we're here to discuss is ultimately the beauty of Jesus, the loving gift of salvation, the gospel. Let's start off there. Let's start, before I get into the science and the nerd business that I love so dearly, let's talk about what the gospel is real quick. The gospel is very simply, as it says in John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him will not perish but have eternal life." So many people have the false notion that Christianity is just you follow the 10 Commandments. You try to be as good as you can, and if you impress God, then you've earned your way to heaven. And then they'll water it down and be like, well, you know, I haven't killed anybody. I'm better than Hitler. Surely God's going to look at Hitler and compare him to me and be like, oh, I guess you're better than Hitler. You can come in. It's not how it works. In the Christian biblical worldview, there are two kinds of people. There are bad people, and there is Jesus. And if you're not Jesus, you're one of the bad people. But the bad people cannot save themselves. That's very clear throughout the Bible. God doesn't say, all right, if you want to earn your salvation and be worthy of heaven, then here's the 10 Commandments. No, what he says is, here's the 10 Commandments. Keep those. And when you are perfect, you will have earned heaven. And Jesus echoes this in Matthew 5. He's like, you got to be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. And his disciples are like, oh snap, we can't do that. No, you can't. But that is why from Genesis chapter 3, the promise was God stepping into human history to be the payment for your sin. That he would crush the head of Satan, that he would break the gates of hell, that he would pay for your sin to give you that free gift that you can't pay for. So all throughout the New Testament, it is made very clear Jesus paid the price. Now, the Old Testament is just pictures of Jesus over and over and over. This is what's coming. This is what's coming. The whole sacrificial system. God doesn't say, you know how small your sins are? Just, sacrifice a dove. That covers it. It's like, here's a picture of what is to come. Here's a picture of the payment that I will provide, which ultimately was Jesus. That Jesus gave his life as the payment for your sins, because the wages of sin is death. And so Jesus said, I will let the death be mine. But then 3 days later, he rose from the grave because death can't keep him down. So that's the gospel. You are just invited to accept the free salvation through Jesus. So where do we hear about the gospel in the Bible? So why is it important that we know the Bible is true? Because it's the only place where you can get salvation. Every other religion, philosophy, and marketing scheme in the universe there is the stairway to heaven. You better start climbing. Might not be room at the top when you get there if you hesitate. You miss a step. It's a long way down. I'm just saying. Christianity, well, the Bible in a whole, biblical Judaism is not in any core sense different than Christianity. It's just that the Judaism of the Bible points toward Jesus. The New Testament points back at Jesus. Those are just arrows pointing to the cross and to the empty tomb. Hallelujah. So, what we are talking about today, we are continuing our conversation about evolution, because evolution is a very popular cult. It's a popular religion which stands in opposition to the truth. And so I am going to show how the opposition to the truth fails so that you can be more confident in your acceptance of the truth. Therein lies today's discussion. So, I have to make sure I am on the right page. I got myself a little slideshow presentation all prepped for you. I'm ready. I was born ready. Sin Hound is ready. Boom! Diggity, my friends. So welcome back once again to Creation, Evolution, Chocolate Bars, and Worms. Now, we've talked about the chocolate bars. We will continue to talk about the worms. These things all come back. So, today, having gone through why evolution fails on its own merits, we are going to See how evolution is used as evidence for evolution. How the religion of evolution just demands you to have faith. Like faith in what? In evolution. Well, what does that mean? Well, let's talk about that in some detail, my friends. So, this is the beginning of any good conversation. Is evolution a fact or is it a lie? It depends on how you define it. Remember your philosophy, everybody. Your good friends, Socrates, Plato. Okay, is this as distracting to all of you as it is to me? I got a shoulder angel holding a rifle. You got to move. I mean, he works here. He's doing a good job, but I can't look at me without seeing him staring over my shoulder. I don't have a shoulder angel on the other side. That's just creepy. So before you have a debate about anything, before you fight about anything, define your terms, children. You have to know what it is you are talking about. So is evolution a fact or is it a lie? It depends on how you define it. So the way I have defined it is I am telling the full story here. Not everybody does. So let me explain some of the common ways that this works out. So is evolution change over time? I got a textbook on the shelf there. It's just the title of the book is Evolution, Change Over Time. Is it descent with modification? I got a comment on Facebook this week telling me evolution is just descent with modification. Changes in allele frequency. A very popular one on the internet is that evolution is, by definition, changes in allele frequency. Or it's any change in genetics from one generation to the next. Again, earlier this week, got that on Facebook. Are you starting to see that there isn't one single agreed upon universal definition for evolution? It depends who you talk to, doesn't it? So, some people will say evolution is natural selection, or they'll say natural selection is evolution. Microevolution over time, things change or evolve over time. There is a laundry list. Now, the problem, as I will point out, is that these aren't real good at telling the story. You have to remember what the story is. The story is the Darwinian tree of life. So as you can see here, we start off in the distant past with no life at all. Where did life come from? We're going to figure that out. You have to have faith in science, children. You have to have faith that someday, what seems to be impossible according to every science we know and even basic mathematics, will someday be proven to be a historical fact. That life made itself. So that you start off with no life at all. You have just rocks and water and chemical. It's like soup, but not made from chicken or noodles. It's just soup. The soup builds a cell, and it's got all of the structures and functions in order to survive. So it's got some kind of membrane, some kind of porous membrane with functions and structures to allow the passage of chemicals in and out, but a controlled structure so that the passage of chemicals are necessary chemicals in and toxic chemicals out. Otherwise, it chokes to death on its own toots. You got to have the ability to process whatever food it eats so that you are metabolizing to create the energy to run the cell. You have to have something to read the genetic information, whether that's DNA or RNA, and coded for in the DNA or RNA is all of the information to create the protein structures for all of the machines that run the cell, that build the cell, and also to replicate the cell. And remember, all of that and more has to happen in that very first cell without any guidance or direction at all. And think about the size of the earth. Think about the size of a bacteria. Think about the size of a drop of water. Not only does it have to all happen in the same drop of water, it has to happen in the same neighborhood of drop of water. Because bacteria are so small that to a bacteria, one of your cells is like a whole neighborhood with lots of different districts. They're tremendously tiny. So all of those different parts and pieces have to come about spontaneously just through chemistry and assemble themselves. But we're not here to talk about the origins. We're here to talk about what happens next. So we're going to pretend that all that happened. That, sure, improbable, but it only had to happen once. So the evolutionary story is once you have that life, however it happened, we don't know, but we have faith that it happened. Somehow bacteria, over time, produced worms. Because for like 2 billion years, the earth was just like an unbrushed tooth. Just a whole bunch of hard enamel covered in plaque. And that was it. No worms, no fish, no lizards, nothing but bacteria. And somehow, something happened wherein multicellular worms and other multicellular creatures just exploded onto the scene. It's called the Cambrian explosion. Boom. And then somehow, in a world with just worms and no fish, somehow fish came into being. And evolution is supposed to be how worms would over time turn into fish. I have a very, very daffy skeptic on the internet telling me nobody in the world is saying that worms turn into fish. That's a straw man. That's a lie. You're a liar, 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 pants on fire. Her name is Deb. And when you ask Deb, okay, if it is a lie that worms turn into fish according to evolutionary theory, now I don't think it's true, but it's what evolution teaches. She's an evolutionist. And she's saying it is a lie that I presented that worms evolved into fish. And I said, all right, if that's a lie, then where did fish come from? And of course, she doesn't have an answer to that, because when there's nothing on Earth but bacteria and worms, and then fish come into being, there's only so many options, Deb. She just loves calling people liars, though. Why is that a lie? Because you're a liar. It's brilliant. It's like stand-up comedy without standing up. Where was I? All right, so worms turn into fish, and then fish turn into lizards. And this is the process that explains how everything came to be. But the purpose of evolution is not to ambiguously say, hey, things happen, things change, but a specific kind of change that will turn worms into fish and fish into lizards and lizards into whatever else comes next. So that is what we need to keep in mind when we are asking ourselves, what is evolution? Now here's the creationary orchard. The creation orchard differs significantly because these are not connected. This is the dog tree. It is a series of unique, distinct trees. So up at the top of the tree here, excuse me while I drink some coffee. It's the change of seasons, my friends. And a warm cup of coffee is needed. And an Arnold Palmer still. Here's the thing about the weather that I find is that summer lasts up to a particular day somewhere after school starts. 2 days ago, you were running the air conditioning because it was 85 degrees. Tomorrow, you will be running the heater because it'll be 42 degrees. But today, for 1 day only, they say, do you want your coffee hot or iced? And you have to go, I don't know. Yesterday I had it iced. Tomorrow I'm going to have it hot. Today, you get that 1 day where the AC and heat, the HVAC, whatever it is, that unit gets to rest for 1 day. And then it goes from AC to heater. Where was I? The trees. The orchard is a series of distinct trees, my sinners and saints. Where in the dog tree, at the top of the tree, up here at the top, today, we have 400 varieties of pet shop dogs that can be bought all over the world, and a whole lot of dogs living out in nature. Out in, uncivilized areas like in Detroit. So, all of those dogs, because they are all dogs, can be traced to a common ancestor, or common ancestors, the pair of dogs that were brought by Noah on the ark during the flood. That's what this blue line is at the bottom of all these trees. That is the genetic bottleneck where whatever variation did exist in the population, it doesn't exist anymore. Because Noah took a pair of every kind, not two of every variety, two of every kind. So 2 of the dog kind on the ark. When you understand the story, it's a lot more plausible. And when you actually see what the Bible says, that's the funny thing about the Bible is it makes more sense when you read it as opposed to when you just hear people talking about it on YouTube. Some of us are valuable, but don't just take my word for it. Open your Bible, see what it says. Where was I? So at the top of the tree, you got 400 varieties of pet shop dog and the wild dogs of today that all came from this common ancestor that was on the ark. Great granddaddy dog. That was my name when I was a rapper, East Coast rapper. I was Granddaddy Dog. Yeah. When you get into the rap game late, you get to pick unique names. I ain't little nothing. I was old when I started. So, all of them are dogs. Oh, I just remember. God bless the skeptics of the world because they say things that if I were to have made it up, I would not believe it. But because it was really said to me, I have to share this with you. I had a person on Facebook this week show me this image and say, well, if you believe this, the creation orchard, then the fact that there are no transitional forms in the fossils is a problem for you. In fact, it's a bigger problem for you than it is for us evolutionists. He was really making this point. Pardon me. I gotta wash that down with some Arnold Palmer. So here's the thing. I had put up an article showing that it is a recognized fact of paleontology that the innumerable transitional forms that go from fish to lizard, from lizard to mammal, and et cetera, all these different transitional forms are missing. That's why it's called the missing link, because it does not exist. There is no evidence. We have 1 billion fossils dug out of the earth in museums all over the world, but no transitional forms between the kinds. We explained that by saying there weren't any transitions. Dogs have always been dogs. Fish have always been fish. Lizards have always been lizards. There was never a lizard fish or a turtle dog or anything like that. And this atheist, a man who writes great long diatribes about how stupid creationists are, put up in response to this article that if you dumb creationists believe this creation orchard stuff, then the fact that there's no transitions in the fossils is a bigger problem for you than it is for us. Now, it is hard sometimes to be polite when speaking the truth. Sometimes the truth is not nice. But this is one of those times where I tried as hard as I could. And I said, so let me get this straight. Your position is we have a model that shows zero transition between different kinds of plants and animals. And therefore, the fact that there are no transitional forms in the fossils proves us wrong. That's where you're standing. Essentially, what it comes down to is a lot of skeptics essentially will use a great many words to communicate, I don't understand your position, but it's wrong and I hate you. At which point I just go, okay, thank you for sharing. I don't know why I took 4 pages of Facebook commentary to say that. Just copy and paste. I don't understand your position, but you're wrong and I hate you. Type that up. Put it down. Make it easy for yourselves, people. Anyway, there are no transitional forms because nothing transitioned from one kind into another. Now, you want to find a transitional form from one kind of dog, or one variety of dog into another variety of dog. Go to the pet store. All you got to do is find another dog. I have friends who had a dog that was half beagle, half chihuahua. You want to find the transitional form for that dog? I think that dog is a transitional form. I think he's like they made one. They made a transition from beagle to chihuahua. I don't know. That's a funny dog. I'll give him that. Anyway, so the creation orchard has dogs as a distinct created kind with all the different varieties. How do all those varieties come about? Through genetic shuffling and occasional loss of functional genes. Because as you shuffle and lose genes, you come up with a lot of varieties of different arrangements and combinations of existing genes, but all of those genes started off in the parent population. That's how it works. So that's the creationary orchard. When we are looking at the possible following generation, so we take generation 1, which is this worm here. I'm in the way of that, aren't I? Give me a second here. I'm going to hide out down here for a second. So we got, where is he at? We got this blue worm here represents generation 1. The following generations can be extinction. His descendants all die. Or his descendants are all exactly the same. Or his descendants are different worms because they are a different arrangement of the existing genes. You don't have to make new genes to get new variations. All of those hundreds of different pet shop dogs did not result from the creation of new genetic information. It's from the shuffling and loss of the genes that started. So this one right here is the only change which is evolutionary. The non-biblical creation evolutionary model is just this one. All right, that is distinct. All this stuff over here, that's all part of the orchard. Let me back up to the orchard here. So here, well, now I'm in the way of the orchard, aren't I? This is the technology. I'm going to put myself at the top of the dinosaur tree. So we start off with all of these different kinds being created, and then one pair of each kind on the ark for the most part. And then how you get all this variation is genetic shuffling, dissemination, genetic drift, as they move from one place to the other, migration. You know, all of that's explained by all of those things. The only thing you don't see here is the accumulation of new genetic information for new structures, functions, and behaviors. That is the purely evolutionary difference. So that, when we get to what is the difference between these two models, it's real simple. Your definition has to explain what is the difference between them. So here's my question. Which of these two models, the creation orchard or the evolutionary tree of life, shows change over time, descent with modification, genetic changes between generations, changes in allele frequency, mutations, natural selection, or genetic shuffling? Which of these two models show that? They both do. Both of these models include all of those things. So if you just pick one of those at random, or even the whole collection and say that's what evolution is, you have just included biblical creation under the umbrella of evolution. So that when you say, do you believe evolution? I can be a young earth biblical creationist and say yes, and you have no disagreement based on your weak sauce definition. Which is why I say your definitions here all fail. You have to distinguish between those two models. If your definition of evolution does not distinguish between the creationary model and the evolutionary model, it's not a good distinction. It's not a good definition. It shouldn't be used. Here's a metaphor. Describe the earth. Well, the true shape of the earth is round, such that it has a radius, a diameter, and a circumference. It has a north and a south. Between the extremes of north and south is an equator, which is in reality a curved line. Now, which have I just described, the flat earth or the globe earth? Take your time, think about it, read through the description there. What have I just described? Have I described a ball or a disc? Well, I'm no math major. I took geometry when I was a sophomore in high school, so it's been a while. But as far as I understand, that description fits both models. This is what the weak sauce definitions for evolution do constantly. It uses a definition that cannot be exclusively applied to one model or the other. So, which one of these shows all of those? Both of them, which is why those definitions fail. Now, here's a real popular one that I get all the time on the social media. Microevolution adds up to macroevolution. Or, according to Smug Cat here, he's cute, but he's smug, asking if microevolutions add up to macroevolution is like asking if I think microgravity adds up to gravity. And the whole point here is they're supposed to be like, you dumb creationists, don't you know that any observed change will add up into big changes over time? Just given enough time, all the things that you stupid creationists acknowledge happening, given enough time, will turn into those big changes where worms turn into fish and monkeys turn into men. That's what happens. You're just saying, oh, well, the part that I can see in my little window, that doesn't make a big change, and therefore big changes don't happen. Mm-hmm. It's amazing, that cat. I want to slap the cat and I want to pet him at the same time. That's cats, man. They're magical that way. So here is a metaphor given to me by an evolutionist who is trying to explain his true faith. Let me get myself out the way a little bit. This is how he was trying to explain to me that I don't understand evolution. He's like, when does this blue box become red? When does it stop being blue? It's like, this is how evolution works. That, you start off with blue, and then much later you have red, but it's a slow, gradual change. Like, where is the point where it stops being blue? It's like, well, there isn't really a point where it stops being blue. It just gradually changes over a long period of time. This is how evolution is. You dumb creationists expect that evolution means that worms are just giving birth to baby fish. And that's not how it works. Okay? If you start off with worms, the change will be so slow and gradual that we won't even expect transitional forms, even though this huge area between the two is nothing but transitional forms. They don't fossilize well. That's all there is to it. So it would happen just slowly and gradually over time, that whatever changes are happening in this worm just keep on happening. You wouldn't say, oh, it's a fish now. It's not until you look at the extreme ends that you go, oh, okay, so it was worms, and much, much later now there's fish. So this is how he explained to me, this is how evolution works, these slow, gradual changes over time. Now, I've already gone through all the proposed slow, gradual changes and shown you that it does not work, but let's humor him for a minute. Is this how it works? Is this legit? Let me remind you of something. Worms don't have the genes to make fish parts, or the software for the function and behavior for those fish parts. I'm going to talk about that a bit more later. But worms don't have the genes for gills and the genes for fins and other fish parts that make fish distinct from worms. So however long you want it to take, you have fish, or you got worms over here, and they got to turn into fish, you somehow have to add the genes for the parts that fish do have that worms don't have. If the process we are talking about doesn't add the genes, and therefore the structures, functions, and behaviors for fish parts to the worms, then you are not going to have fish at the end of the process. You're just going to have more worms. Evolution has to account for the creation of new kinds of plants and animals. To get worms to turn into fish, You have to add parts that worms don't have that fish do have, but those are coded for in genes that fish have that worms don't have. It's redundant. I keep saying these things, but I want you to understand it. Science is not that hard. So, here is my point about this metaphor. When does this blue box become red? Well, I don't know that there is a point where you can say, here's when it stops being blue, here's when it starts being red. That would be difficult. Not impossible, but admittedly difficult. But here's the question. What do you have to add to the blue to make this transition happen? If you just left blue alone, it would just be blue. If you didn't add something to the blue, it would just be still blue. Similarly, if you have worms and you add nothing to them, you don't add the genes for fins and gills and eyes and swim bladder and all the things that make fish fish. You just have worms still. Something plus nothing doesn't change even over billions of years. Blue plus nothing is just blue. So here is the point that he accidentally stumbled upon. Microevolution can't add new genes. Blue doesn't add more blue. In order to get blue to transition to purple and red, you have to add red to it. You have to add something that wasn't already there. The blue doesn't have any red. In order to get blue to turn into purple, you have to add red. In order to get purple to turn into red, you have to keep adding red until there's so much red that you can't see anything else. In fact, you might just remove the blue altogether. That's a matter of degree. But removing the blue doesn't turn blue into purple. Removing the blue doesn't turn blue into red. Adding red is what causes this transition. You have to add something that wasn't already there. Genetically, worms losing worm genes doesn't make fish, makes dead worms. Worms have to gain the genes for structures, functions, behaviors they didn't have to turn them into fish. The only reason fish came into existence on evolution is because worms gain genes they did not have for structures, functions, and behaviors they did not have. That's the point. Now let's take a look at your mechanisms of evolution. Microevolution. This is the microevolutionary changes that, give it enough time, it'll add up. Which one of these produces new genes, new genetic information for structures, functions, and behaviors that didn't already exist? None of them. We talked about that in the last video. If you didn't see that, back it up and check that action out. I'm going to drink some Arnold Palmer. Are you back? Did you watch it? Right? I mean, it's like, right? So, the mechanisms of evolution, which are called microevolution, where Smug Cat is all like, they add up, it's all the same thing. It's the same kind of change. No, it's not. Because none of these do what it takes to make the worm turn into a fish. These are mechanisms of biological change over time, but they're not evolution. And these are mechanisms of biological change over time and not evolution, and they fit the biblical creation model. Genetic drift migration. How did dogs, Arnold Palmer. How did the dogs get from one pair of dogs on the ark to dogs in Africa, in North America, in South America, in, all over the world? Where did those dogs come from? They came from the ark. They genetically drifted. They took with them their particular variation on the original parent population that had been shuffled and disseminated to them. So, migration, it's the same reason why you find things all over the world. Why is it that, you got, camels in Africa and Middle East, you got llamas in Central and South America, but you can interbreed those. You can breed the calamel or the kama. It's because they're the same kind of animal. You can breed them together because they're the same kind, but they're on different continents. How did that happen? Genetic drift migration. They wound up in different places. They adapted due to genetic shuffling, natural selection, not the addition of new genes. You don't need to add genes to the original parent population. It already had all that information in it. So all these proposed mechanisms of microevolution fit the biblical creation model, but they do not do what evolution has to do. They're not evolutionary changes. I'm going to talk about that more in a minute. So your definition has to distinguish between these two models. So which model, creation or evolution, shows change over time, descent with modification, genetic changes between generations, changes in allele frequency, mutations, natural selections, genetic shuffling? They both do. They both show all of those things. So if you're going to pick any one of those and say, well, that's what evolution is, your definition is weak sauce and shows that you don't understand what the theory is teaching and what the model is proposing. It shows that you have a less than grade school understanding of evolution, and so many people who are defending their religion of evolution have this level of understanding. Like, it's just change over time. I'm like, okay, and the Earth is curved. Does that mean it's a globe or a sphere or a disc? Is it a globe or a sphere? Well, which is it? Is it a globe or a sphere? My metaphors work better when I say them properly. So, all of this to say, I have done for you, my dear sweet sinners and saints, what no textbook in the world seems to have done. I have created for you the world's first functional, useful, accurate definition of Darwinian evolution, so that you can actually talk about it as if it's something different from biblical creation. Behold! Evolution, a definition that actually works. Evolution is, read it with me. Evolution is an unguided, natural process which increases the genetic information in an organism, creating new genes which did not previously exist. These new genes then cause an increase in physical complexity and associated behavior, both of which increase the organism's ability to survive and pass on these traits to offspring. Isn't that beautiful? It's glorious. It's like poetry. I want you to use this definition, and when you do, I want you to deposit $5 in my PayPal account to cover the royalties. But I'm going to go through this and explain why this definition works. And again, let me make very clear. This definition is not based on my rejection of Darwinian evolution. There is nothing in this definition where I am setting it up to fail because I disagree with it. There's nothing in here which requires you to first take a literal interpretation of Genesis chapter 1 and first believe that the earth is 6,000 years old and was made in 6 days. You don't need any of that for this definition to work. You need only understand the Darwinian tree of life and the kinds of changes that are proposed to explain what evolution is and what evolution has hypothetically been doing for the past 4.5 billion years, or however long. So, let's break it down. What? Evolution is an unguided natural process. We have to distinguish between things that happen because of the physical universe, because of chemistry, that kind of thing, and things that would happen with nature left to nature with no design. So, dogs. Dogs are perfectly natural. You don't have to make dogs. No person put together squirrel parts to make the dog. The dog we found out in nature. I say that we found them because God made them. Just as the mountain there, Mount Rushmore, God made that mountain through some particular process. Maybe volcanic. I don't know. I wasn't there when it happened. But the point is, what you're looking at here, the poodle on one side and Mount Rushmore on the other, are examples of things that would not happen if nature was just left to nature. Nature. I'm the head of the poodle. That's what I did. Oh my goodness. All right, I'm gonna do this and get out of my way. The poodle, who does not have a head like mine, unfortunately for the poor poodle. Don't make fun of him. He's still beautiful in his own way. The poodle is not an animal that is natural, that it would not occur in nature with nature left to nature. Mount Rushmore is also not something that would result because of nature left to nature. Now, both of these tell us something about nature itself. The ability to create a poodle by breeding different types, to selectively breed dogs until we wind up at the poodle, tells us something about genetic variability, tells us about breeding, tells us about descent with modification, but it does not tell us what nature left to nature would do. Therefore, it tells us nothing about evolution. Similarly, Mount Rushmore tells us about the chemical structure, the strength and stability of the rock that this mountain is made out of. It tells us a lot, but it does not tell us what erosion would do. So the poodle and many breeds of chicken and horses and things like that we have created through selection, through artificial or intentional selection, they don't tell us anything about evolution because they are not what nature would do left to nature. The Chihuahua would not exist in nature. Mount Rushmore would not exist without an intentional artist creating it. So when people point to things like, well, in the lab, scientists created blah, 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 and that proves that something could evolve. No, what it shows is that intelligent interference can result in a wide, diverse range of outcomes. But it does not say that nature left to nature would create. And also, we're distinguishing here between evolution as a natural process And it's meant to be as natural as erosion. That when it rains, the mountain gets worn down a little bit. When the wind blows against it, the mountain gets rounded off. The edges get less sharp because of erosion. A perfectly natural process. The rounded parts of the mountain here at the top, those are not rounded because somebody sanded off the edges. Those are rounded because nature, weather, wind, rain, snow, ice broke off the sharp edges until it was all rounded. So similarly, that kind of erosional change is what evolution is supposed to be, an unguided natural process. Nature left to nature. Now, since I have brought up Mount Rushmore, let me distinguish between one more thing. Evolution is an unguided natural process, but it's an unguided natural process that has to result in the change from one kind to another. So, let me show you what it's not. See these trees down here? Look at that tree. That tree was there long... Now, this is Mount Rushmore long before it was carved. This is nature left to nature. And it includes all these trees down here, these little pine trees. Over here, on the left side, those pine trees are still there. And they've been growing the whole time. So part of the history, the story throughout time of Mount Rushmore includes pine trees growing. But if I were to ask you, name one of the processes that resulted in Mount Rushmore. If you could say, tell me something that happened that took Mount Rushmore from this perfectly natural weathered cliff face and turned it into the face of 4 presidents. It would be entirely invalid for me to say, well, these pine trees were growing the entire time. You can see in this picture, here's a pine tree, and later it's a bit taller. And it's a completely natural process because these trees were not planted by humans. They didn't water them. They didn't prune them. These trees are entirely natural. So as you can see, there is an entirely natural process that turned Mount Rushmore from this mountain into these 4 faces. That would be completely invalid because those are 2 separate, distinct things happening at the same time, on the same timeline, but not related processes. And I have to make this distinction because all the time evolutionists be doing this to me. We'll say, all right, you start off with a generation. Future generations, following generations, there's only so many different things that can happen over time. What happens? Well, you wind up with the exact same thing. Or a shuffling of the genes that exist to create different worms, or the loss of them to create different variations on it, or extinction. And they will point to all of these and say, well, any of these are happening, that's evolution. No, because if the process that's happening is not the one that turns worms into fish, it is not part of the evolutionary story, even if it's on the evolutionary timeline. Just like those pine trees were growing, and that was happening at the same time Mount Rushmore was being carved, it is not part of the process that resulted in Mount Rushmore being carved. Similarly, some line of worms going extinct might happen at the same time that worms are evolving into fish, but it's not going to cause worms to evolve into fish, and therefore pointing at something going extinct and saying, there you go, evidence of evolution happening, is dumb. Stop doing that. Let me remind you, you've got $10. You want to be a millionaire. So what do? You spend that $10 on chocolate bars, and then you sell them for more than you bought them for. That's how market works. You spend money to make money, but spending money doesn't make you money. You have to spend money to get something to sell, but you don't make money until you sell. It is the selling that makes the money. This is 2 different parts. So if you're going to point to genetic shuffling or genetic drift, or extinction, changes in allele frequency, all of these different microevolutionary changes and go, all of those are evolution. No. If you accept evolution as a fact, you are merely saying that all these other things could be happening at the same time, but they would not result in worms turning into fish or fish turning into lizards or any of the actual evolutionary changes. So it's absolutely invalid to point to those and say that those are evolution, just as it's invalid to point to these pine trees to say, well, that's part of the process that carved Mount Rushmore. So evolution is an unguided natural process which increases the genetic information in an organism, creating new genes that did not previously exist. All right, I don't want to get too deeply into genetics right now, but let me clarify that new genetic information does not mean an increase in the number of chromosomes, an increase in the number of genes, an increase in the number of nucleotide base pairs. What it means is that genes code for a particular structure, function, or behavior. I said structure. You know what I mean. In order to get a worm to turn into a fish, you have to add genes that it doesn't already have because it needs to create fish parts that the worm doesn't already have and fish behaviors that the worm doesn't already have. So when looking at us, we have, something in the neighborhood of 20 to 25,000 genes that code for somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 million proteins that form millions of different structural parts of hundreds of different kinds of cells. And all of that had to come from somewhere. Because whatever first cell there was, however you want to pretend it made itself, it did not have the genes to make worms or fish or you. The first worms, however they came to be, did not have the genes to make fish or lizards or anything else up the tree. And so to go from the bacteria to the worm, the bacteria had to gain whatever genes it takes to make a multicellular worm creature. However the worm turned into fish, it had to gain the genes to make fish parts that fish do have that worms don't. For the fish to evolve into lizards, and thus explain why lizards exist. The fish did not have the genes to make lizards. They had to gain those genes so it could have lizard parts, and on, upwards and onwards. So there's this constant need for new genetic information, because genetic information is what codes for these structures, functions, and behaviors that distinguish one kind of thing from another kind of thing. Another thing this does not mean is that genetic information here is not just any new variation of nucleotides. It's not new arrangements or anything. People were like, well, mutations are all examples of new information. No, mutations are the corruption of information. Information results in something. The whole point of information in DNA is that a lot of it, actually not a lot of it, the majority of it is going to be operating system. It's going to be software that runs the cells. But the parts that we've studied the most are the parts that make proteins. So you've got genes that code for particular proteins, which are the physical structures that make up the parts of the cell, and the different cells make up the different organs and organelles in whatever plant or animal we're talking about. So information that doesn't or can't code for a functional part of that plant or animal is not information, it's degraded information. It's like if you spell something wrong, or you take a book and you tear a page out. Well, it's different, but it's not new information. And people will point to absolutely any change. I have seen one person in a rather attitudinal way, what you'll say that there are things in your cell. There are things in all cells that spell check. There are little tiny robots that run up and down the DNA correcting spelling mistakes. Why? Because mutations are harmful. And so you have, built into every living cell, tiny robots that do spell check and correct those mistakes to make sure that as few as possible are kept and as few as possible are passed on to the next generation. And what happens is your cells divide or something like that, and something gets, your DNA gets copied and something gets spelled wrong. So the little robot runs in, finds the spelling error, and fixes it. And an evolutionist, I wish I had the link. In one of my articles, I wrote the link to this. I included the link. It's somewhere in the Defining Evolution series, the Thursday Night Nachos series. But he has said that spelling error, where the mutation occurs, where something gets spelled wrong, it gets copied wrong, that's new information, because that's something it didn't say before. And then the robot comes along and it corrects it. It fixes the spelling mistake. That's another increase in genetic information. 2 increases in genetic information happening all the time. I feel like if you're dumb enough to not see what's wrong with his argument, I can't explain it to you. I'm just going to move on. Worms. Worms don't have the genes it takes to make fish. So every step up the evolutionary tree, every time a branch divides into 2 different kinds of plant or animal, you have to add new genetic information, new genes for structures, functions, and behaviors that did not previously exist. But let me clarify a couple of things. This can happen by mutation of existing genes, but not of genes that are necessary for survival. If you take a worm and you take the genes that it needs to survive and you mutate them, you no longer have the function that gene coded for, that it needs to survive, and that kills your worm. Which means you have some genes that are necessary for survival, just as you have certain vital organs. And if you mess with those, you kill it. That doesn't turn it into a fish. It turns it into a dead worm. So these mutations, these changes, can happen to existing genes, but only genes that are not needed for survival. So the window of opportunity just keeps shrinking. Moving on. Evolution is an unguided natural process which increases the genetic information in an organism, creating new genes that didn't previously exist. These new genes then cause an increase in physical complexity and associated behavior. Why? These new genes have to create an increase in physical complexity and associated behavior. The reason why, number one, is because we are trying to explain the arisal of a new kind of plant or animal. Where did fish come from? Well, they evolved from worms. If the change is some kind of increase in genetic information, but it doesn't result in fish parts, then you don't have fish. You also have nothing for natural selection to act upon. These evolutionary mechanisms can't do anything. It would be a purely invisible change that only the best geneticists doing experiments on genes would ever identify, which that's not how it works. The way the whole evolutionary story works is the increase in genetic information results in new structures, functions, and associated behavior. And here's the thing that a lot of people sort of just aren't aware of, they don't think about, is that this is not just a change in physical structure, but it has to be the associated behavior, hardware and software. And I will here say that I think the software problem is infinitely more complex and much harder for evolution. In fact, as much as I think that the genetic change to create new structures is just definably impossible, that it's so unlikely for mutations to wind up creating legs on a fish. Suppose it did. Suppose that mathematical impossibility did happen, that you've got a fish that now has legs, and let's give it lungs. So now it can be put on land and not die because it has lungs and it's got legs. But what if it doesn't have the software in its fish brain to make use of those legs to not only walk, but to link it to behaviors related to reproduction and survival? What happens? Well, nothing. I mean, take a fish now and, like staple or duct tape legs to it. Does that help it survive? No. It's going to make it die sooner because a fish doesn't know what to do with legs. There's nothing in a fish's brain that knows how legs work or what to do with them. It doesn't know how to run toward food or away from predators. Legs would be an absolute hindrance to a fish unless it had the complex brain software to link the behavior of walking and the ability to move with those legs with all the other types of behavior, like going toward food, moving away from danger, finding a mate. All of these things have to be related in its brain. It has to be able to associate those different behaviors with the different functions. Otherwise, the increase in function is not only not helpful, but it's detrimental. You give a fish legs and lungs and put it on land, but you don't give it the software to use those functions for particular behaviors, you just have a dead fish. And the software in the brain of the simplest thing is tremendously complicated. A bee can determine the relative distance and position of flowers from its hive, go back to the hive, and use interpretive dance to explain to the other bees the relative position and distance of those flowers. And the other bees can watch its interpretive dance and understand that it is telling it that it is communicating the relative position and distance of flowers relative to the position of the hive. And then they have the behavior to follow that set of instructions to go find those flowers. Now think about all the multiple different steps there. What if one of those steps didn't evolve with all of the others? What if all of these bees just evolved? And we're getting to the software issue, but think about the complexity of the brain of a bee, how small it is, but all of the things it's capable of doing. Number one, it's got to find the flowers. It has to identify it as a food source. Number two, it has to figure out the relative position and distance from the hive. It has to be able to communicate that through dance. It has to be able to read and understand the information communicated through dance. It has to then be able to act on the information by going to those flowers and getting the food to bring it back to the hive. If one of those steps didn't evolve with all the others, you have an enormous wasted amount of energy where bees are dancing or flying, but they're not surviving. If you could somehow evolve all but one of those behaviors at any given time, in a single generation, you could just evolve all of those but one in a single generation, no further generations. They all go extinct. It would kill them because it would be so much wasted time and energy that they wouldn't be able to survive. All of that software is all contained in the bee's head it's not even complex enough that we tend to call it a brain. It's software written into some hardware in its head But how did that happen? How did that happen by accident, by chance, by blind, random, accidental chance? It's absurd. But every step up the evolutionary ladder in terms of animals has to have some kind of associated software to control the increase in physical complexity. Not just so the legs can move and walk and transport the character, the individual organism, whatever it is. But the fish lizard, having the ability to walk, also has to have the software so that its walking has behavior associated with it in relationship to survival and reproduction. And if all of that software isn't there, those new structures are a hindrance. And so if you wind up with the hardware, the physical complexity of having legs without the associated software of that behavior, that whole line goes extinct. They are less likely to survive. Once again, evolution is asking the impossible multiple times over. So, worm to fish requires the genes for fish parts added to the worm genome, structures resulting from those genes, control functions in the brain for those new structures, and behavior to use those structures and functions for survival and or reproduction. All of that has to happen all together at the same time, because to have one but not the others, or to have most of them but not all of them, winds up in death and extinction. Finally, evolution is an unguided natural process which increases the genetic information in an organism, creating new genes that did not previously exist. Both of these genes then cause an increase in physical complexity and associated behavior, both of which increase the organism's ability to survive and pass on these traits to offspring. Very, very simply, things that don't reproduce, and therefore don't have offspring. Dead things also don't reproduce, and also don't have offspring. So the path from worm to fish or any other evolutionary step requires survival and passing on genes to new offspring, which means if the worm gains some genes such that it becomes invincible worm, but doesn't have offspring, it's not an evolutionary step. If, let's say, it gains a new pheromone, which makes it irresistible to the girl worms, and so it winds up having lots of offspring, but that pheromone also attracts predators, it's only going to have a lot of offspring that one generation. But because it's attracting predators, they're going to be eaten faster, and that line will go extinct. That leads to extinction. So just because there's a mutation that results in a new kind of structure or function or behavior does not mean that's going to be beneficial and lead into the evolutionary future. There are further hurdles that you have to go over, and it's both reproduction and survival for all future generations. If you're Spider-Man and you are virtually indestructible and you're superhuman, but that doesn't help you reproduce and have children, or you can't pass it on so that the next generation has those same abilities, you're a mutant, you're a superhero, but that's it. Not an evolutionary step. So there's multiple hurdles for all of this to go over. Let's look at it one more time here. So this is my definition that I have come up with that I want you to use because it does clearly distinguish evolution from the competing and diametrically opposed model of biblical creation. Evolution is an unguided, natural process which increases the genetic information in an organism, creating new genes that didn't previously exist. These new genes then cause an increase in physical complexity and associated behavior, both of which increase the organism's ability to survive and pass on these traits to offspring. A definition that works. So, is evolution a fact, or is it a lie? When you define it to mean what Darwin meant, it is a lie. It is scientifically impossible and is logically indefensible. There is no evidence for it ever having happened or being capable of happening. It is impossible. And if you're using it for something which does happen, like the whole microevolution thing, you're misapplying the term, which is the majority of it, I think. I think most people who say, well, evolution's a fact, they're then pointing to things that aren't evolution. They are misapplying the term. So there you go. We're going to talk about that more in the future. There's more things to discuss, more science, my little friends. But that's enough for today. I hope you learned something. You can send me questions, leave me comments. Try not to make them stupid. That's all I ask. So, I am your friendly neighborhood Sin Hound. I just want you to remember the whole purpose of all this. In a nutshell, Jesus loves you. That's what it comes down to. For God so loved the world that he sent his only Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish but have eternal life. You find that good news in the Bible. It's called the gospel. The Bible also tells us where we came from and how we got into this mess. Why do we have a mess that we need to get out of? It's in the Bible. That's all I got. So, I will see you next time. In the meantime, continue to tell the stories that bring life. Be excellent to each other. And party on, dudes.